Hey, it's Mike from epicduckstudios. Today you can follow along while I paint the Reaper Mousling Pirate, which I'll be using in my Frostgrave games against Ash and Owen. I haven't decided how I'm going to base these models yet, so I'm just going to quickly start the miniature by blocking in the base with just some plain black. Since the majority of the model is covered in fur, I'm going to go ahead and base coat pretty much the entire thing with a light brown color. You'll see me shade this later with some highlights and some shadows. I'm trying to keep the brown off the areas that don't need it as much as possible, which is basically just a little bit of clothing, his tail, his sword, and his bandana. I do get a little bit on there, but I want to avoid having to paint over and correct things as much as I can. You can see that this particular brush isn't really in great shape anymore. The bristles on the end are starting to sort of differentiate, and there's a little bit of gap between them. I really just use this brush for dry brushing and base coating. Any detail work I'll leave for brushes that are in better shape. With the light brown base coat out of the way, I'm going to start picking out the details I want to paint black. Mainly going to be his gloves, his belt, his eye patch. That's probably it. Basically anything leather on the model, I'm going to be painting black. I'm going to start with just a simple flat black base coat. Next, I'm going to use a dark red to base coat his bandana. We'll add some highlights to this in a lighter red afterwards. I'm really taking my time here to make sure I don't paint over the black strap from his eye patch, which kind of crosses over his bandana. I don't want to have to repaint that later. Now I'm putting a base coat on the metal aspects of the model. That's really just going to be the sword, his belt buckle, and he has one earring as well. I'm using a fairly bright silver color for this as opposed to a chainmail or bolt gun metal kind of color. I'd forgotten to paint the pirate's unpatched eye earlier when I was painting all the other black details, so I'm coming back to do that now. It's a little bit tricky because it is very small and it's a very small miniature, so I'm going to go ahead and just box it in with a little bit of brown because it's easier to make a mistake and fix it in this case than to do it completely perfect the first time. I also got a little red paint over the fur here, so I'm going to touch that up. Now I'm going to go ahead and base coat the tail using a tanned flesh tone, in this case Reaper Suntan Flesh. Using the same flesh color I used for the tail, I'm also going to paint the inside of the ears and the muzzle. Finally, his bare toes on his right foot will also be painted in the skin tone. At this stage, all the base coats are out of the way, so it's time to start doing some detailing. I'm going to start by adding a lighter red color to the bandana to make it stand out more. Red paint, especially light red paint, often needs a couple coats to go on and get good coverage. Finally, I'm going to highlight the knot on the back of the bandana to make it a little more distinctive as a feature so it doesn't just become a shapeless blob of reddish and brown at the back. Using a light skin tone, I'm going to brighten up the inside of the ears to make them look a little more thin and transparent. There also wasn't a whole lot of difference between the suntan flesh color and the light brown fur, and I want more variation in the colors of the model. To draw more attention to his face, I'm also going to make the muzzle lighter so it also stands out. Since the pirate's mouth is open, I'm going to paint the open mouth with the dark red used for the base coat of the bandana. And because I got a little bit of red paint where I didn't want it, I'm going to touch that up with the flesh tone. I'm going to use a tiny bit of light pink to make the nose stand out from the surrounding muzzle. Although it's very short, this pirate does have one peg leg. I'm actually using the tanned skin tone as the base for this. Once we throw a brown wash on this later, it'll be very different from the rest of the skin tone. Now I'm adding some shading to the fur so it doesn't look so flat. I'm just using lighter and lighter shades of brown, going around basically the top surfaces, in this case the top of the left ear, and just bringing the color up a little bit so it looks like there's some light glinting off them. I'm going to continue just working around the model and doing the same for other bits of upward facing fur. In this case, his eyebrows and the top of the muzzle. And here I'm adding a little bit of color to his cheeks. Because the Mouslings are such small models, you really don't have to put a lot of effort into your blends to make them look believable. There's just not much distance between the different areas of color. And now for the tricky part, I want to add a little bit of glint to his good eye and a small skull and crossbone pattern to his pirate eye patch. To make all the black leather I painted earlier more interesting and give it a shiny look, I'm going to add white edge highlights to all of it. I'm actually using a light gray here first, and I'll jump to white later. Because you really only want to add highlights where light would naturally reflect off a model, and the assumption is that the light source is above the model, I only worry about adding these to the upper surfaces, so I'm not going to highlight the bottom of the belt or the bottom of his fingers, etc. Really just working on the upward facing edges. I want to make the tail more interesting, so I'm going to paint it lighter towards the tip and use some blending techniques to just smooth out the color transition. I'm not really doing a wet blend here so much as I'm just taking advantage of the fact that the paint is a little bit translucent, so I put it on in a thin enough coat. It'll take care of letting you see the transition itself. Now that the majority of the detailing is done, I'm going to add an ink wash using Citadel Agrax Earthshade to really start making the fur and details pop. I'm applying this to pretty much the whole model, but I'm being very selective about where I apply it. I'm trying to force it into the gaps between different areas of detail, but I'm also being pretty liberal with it on the fur. You can see here I really work it in around the bandana and where the ears kind of join the head, but I leave the tops of the ears almost entirely untouched. To bring a little more color to the model, I'm going to add a little bit of a blue transition to the sword. I'm just using some turquoise paint that's been mixed mostly with water, so it's probably 1 part paint to 3 or 4 parts water here. I'm just repeatedly applying it in the crevice between the sword and the hilt and feathering it out just a little bit. This will just give the sword a slight cool metal appearance, but also bring another tone into the model for just some interesting color variation. After the wash, the bandana is starting to look just a little bit dull, so I'm going to add a little bit of the bright red back onto it. There's a few places on the model where I thought the wash could have been a little more prevalent, so I'm going to go ahead and just spot wash those next. Using some pure white, I'm going to just improve on the glint in the pirate's eye. I'm also going to use the pure white to improve the edge highlights on the black leather and make it look much shinier. I'm not going over the hole highlighted earlier, but instead just picking out small details, specifically where there's a corner or a sharp crease, where light might more naturally bounce off that point. And that's it! The Mousling Pirate is now ready to hunt Frostgrave for treasure. Thanks for watching, and as always, do something epic.